This is a buying guide for Premier fiberglass Timps. These are great drums, um, and very easy to sort of suss out what condition they're in. Essentially, just have a look around. I've got various different sorts here. This is a new version, but have a look at the bowls, see whether there's any marks in the bowls. Obviously, the next stage is then to play them. After generally sussing out the condition, play the drums, see whether they all work, see whether the pedal's working. The pedal should go up and down easily. This head's too slack. So it's so when you're putting them back, make sure that the main pull rod just clips down into the spider. These are old drums that I'm actually in to be serviced. So I've laid it on the side so that you can actually get underneath and have a look. First thing I noticed is that the heel is totally worn flat. You see this line here, it continues all the way to the front, whereas on the newer one, if we come down here, you can see that that's the line of the casting that you see on the other one, and it continues all the way along, and actually there should be this heel here. When that heel is missing, what happens is that you end up with wear on this point here on these main rods, and this is interfering with the tuning, so this needs to be looked at. While you're underneath, just make sure that everything's there, and check that all these bolts are tight, and you can do that from the outside. You can just move the drum about. If I come over to this one, you can see that the whole drum wobbles and creaks, and that's because they're not tight at this point. Going up to the top, feel along the bearing edge here, make sure that there's no imperfections, no hollows or bumps. I'll explain what's going on with that in a minute. And make sure, look at the gauges, make sure that they're tight. You see this one's really wobbly on the drum. These can be tightened up from the outside. The earlier ones means the bowls has to come out, but make sure all the indices are there. These are actually quite expensive now. And make sure that the pull rods are actually sort of, integral. These tend to snap. These newer ones tend to snap at this point here where that screw goes through. The older pull rods just bolt through the metal casting. There should be some little felt washers there on the original design. This is hanging loose because it's actually missing this universal joint. These are now obsolete, so I have to make something up for this drum, and that's going to be a costly repair. You can see that there's lots of indices, missing on here, but check these, again, that these are wobbling, and that this screw underneath on the pointer is not stripped or snapped off. Have a look at the clutch mechanism. Make sure that all the screws, all the parts are here, are there on both sides. Make sure that this castellated knot here is actually is on the drum. That's quite important, and a common source of problems occur because that nut is missing. They are available. Looking at the actual bowl itself, you can see that I've taken off the lubricating, the PTFE tape, to get a better look at this edge to see how this is formed. What we've got is if this is the outside of the drum, the edge comes down like that on the inside, and this bowl comes round like that. Obviously, that's a lot bigger. As this is made, the fiberglass is lapped up and over this edge like that, and then the polyurethane is dabbed in with a brush here, to make sure that this is fully saturated. If this is not saturated, you end up with a dry joint on this corner. As this is laid down, this fabric, the fabric is always wanting to lift up in that direction, so you end up with an air pocket inside. In that air pocket, the salt crystals from the polyurethane build up because there's a space in there, and as moisture comes in from the outside, those salt crystals start to expand, and as they expand, it forces a lump on the outside. That's what you're feeling for when you're running your finger around the ridge. See whether there's that lump. If that has collapsed because it's only like really thin, the material that's going over there, if that has collapsed, you're left with a void, And so obviously you're feeling for either bumps or voids or cracks underneath, and you can press quite firmly to see whether there's a crack. Not irreparable, and most things on these drums are repairable, but obviously they all require parts. The parts are relatively expensive, and it all takes time, and time is expensive. So when you're looking at the drums, that's what you're actually trying to assess: is how much of a repair bill are you going to have to, to swallow in order to get the drums into a working condition. But that said, these drums are actually very good. The fiberglass drums are light, and the Premier drums on the whole are really quite robust. The gold drums are quite old now. They must be, like 40 years old, and they're still working. Yes, they need a bit of TLC. Yeah, they're not sounding their best, but a service and they'll be great. And for the application, if kids are moving these around and they're banging them through doors and stuff, the Premier drums, more than any other drum on the market, represent the best value for money. They will last. Other drums won't last. It's as simple as that, And what I see in a lot of other drums is that the quality of the casting itself, the actual material that the castings are made out of, are substandard. You don't get that with British engineering. You get quality. And that's what you need to be paying for. They're expensive. All drums are expensive. But if it comes down for me, if it comes down for like a couple of £100 either way, I would always buy the better quality. And actually, it will last. It will give you the service. And these drums hold their value now. They've done their depreciating, and actually they will always, they'll be worth now what they will be worth in 10 years time. So they really are a good set of drums. Obviously, when you're looking to buy them, you can't be taking the heads off and this, that, and the other. You're looking for missing parts, and obvious damage, and making sure that everything works, tuning them up, all of that sort of stuff. You can do that. You can, if there are any missing parts, you can phone up and I'll go through what the prices are. I'll work out a quote for you. If there are any issues that need to be repaired, I can give you a typical thing. On the gold drum, because this whole drum moves about, and you can see it really moves about, this needs a full service. It needs to be fully overhauled. You can't just bolt that together and expect it to work and sound properly. You actually need to know what you're doing. Timpani are a mechanical thing, but it's a musical instrument. So knowing what you're doing is actually critical. And I would say that it took me, when I was working at the shop, yes, I thought I knew what I was doing, but it's as the years have gone on, I've begun to fully understand what's going on in these drums. The immediacy of being able to sort them out isn't necessarily the case, and I see a lot of drums that have been worked on that just, it's a wrong way to go about repairing them. For instance, the wear on the pedal, screwing in a bit of plastic or a bit or rubber underneath this pedal to raise it up is never going to work in long term. They just shear off, and this actually creates more work later on. So it doesn't constitute value for repair. Because actually it takes longer to do a pad underneath than it would be just to get the things, sorted out properly. And then, and accept the fact that in 40 years' time, you're going to have to do it again. Finally, coming back to the top, one last point that I should have mentioned is run your finger around the counter hoop. Make sure that there's no dents in this counter hoop. This is critical to the sound of the drum. You can see in the light whether it's got any points where it's been dented. Typically, if something's been dropped on it. On these newer drums with the powder coating, they're harder to actually see. But again, you can run your fingers around it and you can feel for any imperfections. And that's it. Generally, give them a look over. Make sure that everything's, that the struts are firm, that the gauge is firm, and that the pedal's working, and look for missing parts. Other than that, as long as they sound good, you've got a good buy.